This is Mother Ulterior. Welcome to my realm. Now, something that weighs on my mind a bit when it comes to the ladies is that there seems to be a great lack of interest in history. Unless it's the history of menstruation in period art, or the misogynist, oppressive historical attitudes behind the wonder bra, women, in general, do not have an interest or inclination towards deep dive history. And most of our general history knowledge as it is often left over from high school or college, and whatever Hollywood might say is inspired by true events. Now, I don't say this as an attack on women. In fact, I completely understand this, as there was once a time that I was myself the same. I would read often sensationalized, supposed first-hand accounts and think that this was the equivalent of becoming historically literate. And oftentimes it would turn out that these kind of books are just as fabricated as any Hollywood dramatization of any true event anyway. I will say that these days it's certainly true that both men and women share this disinterest in true deep dive history, given over as we are now to meaningless vice and countless distractions. No, the disinterest in history worries me because the women that I do know who are interested, who do care, who put a lot of work into actually learning histories, are some of the wisest women I've met. When a woman is properly equipped with in-depth knowledge of the way certain things have come to be, or the way other certain things were manipulated in order to manufacture their consent, this woman becomes, at the very least, somewhat impervious to future emotional manipulations. I find it interesting that while the modern feminist movement craps on about empowerment and getting women into STEM fields, there's an active discouragement towards any woman who might be interested in learning histories that might shine a very harsh light on many of our current social norms. Everyone seems to throw around the phrase, history repeats itself, without ever a thought to the minutiae of detail that will create the scenario to be repeated. What does this have to do with the title of my video, you might ask? I'd like to think that we are all familiar with who Lenin is, a key figure, an icon, if you will, of Soviet Russia, who came to power in 1917 as a result of the violent Bolshevik Revolution. Now, this revolution was essentially a complete upheaval of a nation's established leadership and economical model and social mores, and what followed was some of the darkest times in that country's history. The installation of Lenin as leader marks the official beginning of the USSR. If you're listening to this and are uninitiated in the horrors of the communist Russian state in the hands of the Bolsheviks, I might recommend that you undertake a little bit more study before continuing with me. Now, I would like to focus for a little bit on one very specific current social norm for women as it was once practiced under Bolshevik communist rule. And I'm referring to our modern-day sacrament of abortion. Now, under the Russian Empire, abortion was illegal. In the later years of the monarchy, basically their death throes, the movement had already began to at least decriminalize the procedure. But it wasn't until 1920, 3 years into Lenin's rule, that abortion was made legal within the USSR with their Decree on Women's Health Care. This made Soviet Russia the first European country to do so, and in fact they were the first country to actually have abortion available on request, often for no cost. Now, this saw the nation's abortion rates begin a steady, consistent climb upward, seeing jumps of over 100% some years, which then led to a few restrictions being brought in 1926. But even with an initial drop in cases, once again the numbers continued to climb upwards. When the Russian leadership realized that the population could not sustain itself if this trend upward were to continue unabated, they then introduced a migration scheme pushing diversity to enable foreign workers to come in and maintain the status quo. Psych! Just kidding. No. What the Soviet leadership actually did under Stalin in response to these abortion rates that threatened their population numbers was to actually make abortion illegal again, even introducing some very pro-family legislation. Now, this is something I find a lot of uni student wannabe communists try to pretend never happened, but then one could say that regarding almost the entirety of communist history. Despite the complete ban on abortion, though, like Pandora's box, once a taboo is removed, the morality itself that adjusted to accommodate its removal becomes resistant to legislation, and the numbers remain consistent for a few more years before seeing a proper decline in the 40s, hovering on or around 8% of total pregnancies ending in abortion. All this changed, though, when Stalin died in 1953. Almost immediately, a new decree regarding abortion was issued. The decree stated that measures carried out by the Soviet state to encourage motherhood and protect infancy, as well as the uninterrupted growth of the consciousness and culturedness of women, allowed for the change in policy. The implication of this was that women would still choose motherhood over abortion, and that preventing abortion was still the aim of the government. But once again, the numbers prove that when social and legal permission is given to something that was once a taboo, once the choice for the taboo is legitimized, the choices made will show a preference towards the formerly taboo, and not for the motherhood that such legislation claimed to protect. Within the first year of this new decree, the abortion rate jumped to 16%, essentially doubling. So, when faced with the legally and socially acceptable choice of terminating their future children over motherhood and all its sacrifice and responsibility, the women of Soviet Russia made their choice, and by 1958, and over the decades that followed, over half of all pregnancies in the USSR ended in termination. Russia still regularly tops the list of countries that have the highest rate of abortion as percentage of population, surpassing even China, which is also high on that list. As well as Cuba, you might be surprised to know. Something about communists and abortion. Now, why does all of this matter? And what does it have to do with us today? Once again, I'm assuming that you, dear listener, have enough knowledge of history that you are aware that the United States and Great Britain allied with the USSR during World War II in order to defeat the National Socialist forces of Germany. But this seems to be where most people's awareness of this alliance end. The realities of communist Russia under Lenin, under Stalin, were not a mystery to the leaders of the day, yet this alliance was still formed. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were referred to as the Big Three, and they controlled all Allied strategy. And the phrase "the four policemen" was given to this alliance with the inclusion of China, another totalitarian communist genocidal state. This Big Three alliance was formalized by the Declaration by United Nations on January 1, 1942, and this declaration is the basis of the modern-day UN. I like to refer to this alliance as basically making a deal with the devil. The Bolsheviks employed mass rape, starvation, inhumane cruelty, torture, and genocide as just some of their tools. And we were made party to this when our leaders chose their side. At the end of World War II, the UK, the US, and others abandoned Eastern Europe to fall into darkness behind the Iron Curtain, and we all settled in for a period of obscene wealth, prosperity, and comfort. How could we align ourselves with the forces of evil and then simply walk away, seemingly unscathed. The key word here is seemingly. This is where I will now attempt to tie my threads together. After World War II, the West, the Allies, gradually began to adopt certain policies of communist Russia. Abortion restrictions across the Western world began to relax in the decades after World War II. As we basked in our glory and slid into hedonism, the West became fertile ground for the seeds that had once before sowed the harvest that had been reaped by the USSR. The morality, or spirituality if you can call it that drove the Bolsheviks, our great allies, now stuck to the fabric of our nations like a bad smell, where it has festered and intensified ever since. I'm not saying that the Allies stole abortion from the Soviets and ran with it. What I am saying is that the Big Three alliance may be in the past, but it was the foundation upon which this new road we have all been down since was built. For it is after this unholy alliance and war were put to bed that our own shift towards the society we see today began. I understand that some might argue that abortion is simply a female right that would have been introduced with or without this unholy alliance with the Bolshevik communists. But this would be to miss the point that all legislation and policy comes from a man's sense of morality. While the tale of just how abortion took social and legal hold in our own societies is another video in itself, today I am talking about the spirit of the Bolsheviks, born from their Marxist ideology that lives on in the Allied nations. When we, the West, tied ourselves to the communist beast that was rampaging through Eastern Europe, it was only inevitable that we too would become corrupted merely by our own complicity. And one simply has to look at the current state of many of our nations to recognize that, in the years since that so-called Great War ended, our very society, our culture, has taken a path that claims to progress, but only on an increasingly downward and regressive path, obsessed with matters of sex and fixation on genitalia. From the rubble of post-war Europe, a belief, an ideology, a spirituality crept into our very foundations. And now the women of today can see themselves mirrored in the attitudes that once prevailed in the women of the Bolshevik communist regime. I know women that would be proud to have this said about them. How does it make you feel? So thank you, Lenin. Thank you from women everywhere. Thank you for overthrowing a status quo and smashing a big bad taboo and introducing a lowered bar for humanity, passing the baton onto us when we stretched out our hands in alliance. One might argue that it is simply a coincidence that the very first Earth Day took place on the 100th birthday of Vladimir Lenin on April 22, 1970. But I would reply that one only needs to have eyes to see that the Bolshevik spirit that lives on today isn't just alive, but thrives now in our own welfare states that we otherwise call a nation. A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet, and a society that reflects a true communist mentality, even if called a democracy, is still a spiritual communist state. I wonder what else we may have picked up from our wonderful Bolshevik allies. And what are the implications of this in light of where we are now and where we are going? Aren't you glad we won? This is Mother Ulterior. Have a blessed day.